being revisited in Washington and in Beijing. China's 14th five-year plan in the making, the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party coming up later this year, the ratification process ongoing for the comprehensive agreement on investment that the EU and China have just recently concluded in principle the negotiations for. So big questions on the table, and we really look forward to providing you with some answers, or at least tentative views on these issues. Let me introduce you to the program, and for that I would like to invite my colleagues who have control over the PPT to actually move forward. Next slide, please. So we will have a part that involves you to get us started. After a few more words by me, the audience survey as agenda point number 2. We will then get started with a great panel, What's in Store for China's Domestic Politics and Economy, moderated by our great colleague Bernhard Bartsch from Bertelsmann Foundation. After that panel, there will be a short break, don't be surprised, and we will follow up with a short input by my wonderful colleague Lucrezia Poggetti on a survey that we've conducted among more than 1,000 respondents all across Europe and internationally on what's happening in 2021 in EU-China relations. This will be followed by a panel which brings you a selection of great experts and practitioners on exactly that topic, Europe's China strategy for 2021, moderated by a wonderful colleague, Jakob Hanke from Politico. And with that, I think we can move on to a few more announcements and also a review of what has happened last year. The first announcement that I have to make is that we will not only involve you today in this event, but also invite you to become a China Fox 2 to share your insights and forecasts. And we've partnered with the crowd forecasting platform Good Judgment Open to share a few questions that drive us and motivate us to do our work, and we invite you to also do that. Join us at the GJO website to forecast on some key domestic and international developments going forward. The second announcement that I want to make, and would like to move on to the next slide, is that indeed one of the questions that we have there is one that drives us also day and night, about the Chinese comprehensive agreement on investment that has been concluded between China and Europe. And that's one of the questions that you can answer when you go on that website. The second announcement is on a study that we will launch tomorrow. So it's a busy start of the year for all of us. And I have pulled out one finding from the survey that I just earlier mentioned, conducted among more than 1,000 participants across Europe. What do experts and the wider audience think, the wider public, about the key trends of decoupling? And that's an issue where you see respondents saying it's digital infrastructure and data the core issues that will feature most in terms of decoupling. And if you want to dig deeper into all of this, we have a great publication being rolled out just tomorrow with EUCCC, the European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing. And we very much look forward to seeing you for further discussions on this issue. And if you can move on, please. Just one more. I also would like to use this occasion to share with you that there's a new publication that you can subscribe for, MERICS Briefing EU-China Review, a weekly and a monthly, provided by our great new analyst, Gregor Stetz, founder of EU-China Hub. So more work on EU-China relations that is in the store for you. And please make sure that you subscribe to these new publications. And finally, I think we can move on to that part where we look back at what we did last year in terms of forecasting development in 2020. And without going into the details of that, as for the political outlook from our last year's survey, many participants have argued that the course of the Chinese leadership will be actually that we will see Xi Jinping, the president and party leader, to strengthen his grip on power. The biggest issue was predicted to be Hong Kong. I think in many ways that was quite true. I think we have been wrong with regard to our predictions, how China would deal with COVID-19 crisis that was just unfolding in January when we did our forecasting event. The prediction there was that it would be less successful. And with regard to other issues, the nature of the social credit system, I think we have been getting this quite right. Can we move on to the next slide, the economic predictions from last year? The dominant narrative on China's economy was meant to be state control over the economy. I think we've been, to some extent, right, but in many ways also wrong, because obviously the dominant narrative was about China recovering much quicker than anyone else from that crisis. On reform efforts and other issues, we've probably gotten it better. And I think that's a good starting point for our conversation today, to look back. But now looking forward, this is an invitation to you, and I would like to invite you to pull out your mobile phones or open another tab in your browser and go to that website that you find here on the screen, menti.com, and enter that code 415321 and 4, or use the QR code that you see on the right side. There might be also a link pasted in the Zoom chat that brings you directly to that Mentimeter survey that we want to conduct with you. And I'll give you a few seconds to make sure that you can connect. And in the meantime, my colleagues from the IT can probably pull up the survey indeed. So you still see once more that link here on the top, menti.com, and please use the code 415321 to connect to that. And we have a few questions for you, and would love to take your input and your views before we move on to the first panel. And with that, here's the first one. In your opinion, which course will China's leadership take? And I think I probably have to reconnect here to make sure that you see it also on the screen. But in the meantime, please continue with your responses online.
So responses
are coming in. That's fantastic. Multimedia setup here creates some interesting challenges for moderators. So I think the overall picture is quite clear. The responses that you have chosen are clearly going in the direction of a strengthened leadership grip on power, Xi Jinping, his person. Any other option is really that invisible that I actually can't see it properly on the screen here for me. I hope you can see it better. And there is one section here where intra-party opposition might get some greater visibility going forward. But that's certainly something that we will need to discuss in the next panel. More than 90% say Xi Jinping will continue his strengthen his grip on power. Can we move on to the second question? By the way, thanks for 300 and more votes already, and I hope you all have a chance to cast your votes. Second question for you is, which of the following issues, and that's really geographies, countries, will be the biggest test for the Chinese Communist Party CCP leadership in 2021? And I see answers flying in, which is fantastic. Obviously, some of the responses are not included here, and we'll be happy to share the results with you after the event. Fair balance here between the Taiwan issue and Hong Kong issue as being in the lead with regard to the biggest test for the Chinese Communist Party in 2021. Again, an issue that I very much look forward to the discussion in the coming panels later today. Wonderful, more than 330 votes already cast. And I think with that, with final votes coming in here, we can, and we'll share the final results with you later. Next question. In your view, what will be Europe's dominant narrative on China's economy in 2021, ranging from market liberalization to economic stress, state control over the economy? So I hope you are able to cast your votes also on this question. And this is a bit more of a mixed view here that is being generated. State control and economic recovery, obviously not exclusive of each other. On the contrary, probably, but it's good to see a greater diversity of view also on these issues. That makes it more interesting for us to discuss it in the coming panels. We have roughly 300 votes already being cast, and I'm to some extent surprised, or at least I think it's worth discussing how little expectations there are with regard to market liberalization and opening, because obviously that's the dominant narrative that we would be seeing coming out from Beijing in the coming days and weeks. Question number 4, before we hand over to the next panel. What will be the focus of China's domestic politics in 2021? Tech, self-reliance, domestic consumption, greening the economy, stability of the financial system, or stability also socio-economic wide. We have a strong vote for tech self-reliance, obviously with a view to recent measures and policies being introduced, but also the unfolding US-China tech rivalry. So stability and self-reliance, a strong majority of colleagues and experts and participants thinking that this will be the main story for 2021 as we look at what's happening in China. And I would like to thank you for continuing to cast your votes. Again, 330 colleagues have done that already. And with that, I think I will hand over and invite my IT colleagues to turn back to the presentation while votes are still flying in, and go immediately into panel number 1. For that, I would like to introduce our great moderator, Bernhard Bartsch, who is not only with the a senior expert China and Asia Pacific at Bertelsmann Foundation, but also, and that's great news, our incoming Director for External Relations at MERICS. So what's in store for China's domestic politics and economy? And with that, I would like to hand over to Bernhard, and I wish you good fun with your wonderful panelists, which you will introduce in a second. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miko, and welcome to this first panel where we are going to look at China's domestic politics and economy. I am quite starstruck by the panel that we have, and I will introduce them one by one and start with one opening question to our 4 panelists, asking them all to quickly give us your view on the Mentimeter survey that we just did and how that resonates with your expectations for the year. We'll go in alphabetical order. I'm very pleased that we have with us George Magnus, an economist, a research associate at Oxford University and at SOAS in London. George, how do you see this survey? Is this in line with your expectations?
Mostly, I'd say. To be honest, I think under the leadership, there's overwhelming majority for Xi Jinping strengthening his grip on power. I think that seems to be most plausible. Of the issues likely to test the CCP, again, Hong Kong and Taiwan figure very prominently. I wonder whether the 5% for India might be a little bit low, but obviously we'll see before long. On the domestic narrative on the economy, post-COVID recovery and state control of the economy, again, quite predictable. Nico said that the 12% in favor or citing market liberalization and opening was quite low. I thought it was quite high, but there you go. We can debate that. And then finally, on the focus of domestic politics, Tech self-reliance, I think, is pretty much a huge shoe-in. Socioeconomic stability, domestic consumption. I think I think it wasn't huge. It was 18%. It seems to me that it's going to be, at least rhetorically, quite a big issue for China. Whether they actually manage to do that with a carefully worked out program, I think is a moot point.
Thank you, George. We'll go into this in more detail. I'd like to welcome Rana Mitter, who is a professor for the history and politics of modern China at Oxford University, is also the vice president-elect of the British Academy, and all of our panelists have written a pile of books. I believe Rana Mitter's book is the most recent one, and I enjoyed it over Christmas, China's Good War, which tells us a lot about nationalism in China and the history of it. Rana, when you look at the Mentimeter survey, what sticks out for you?
Well, like George, in some senses, I was not all that surprised by what I saw, but I did note in particular the idea of Taiwan as being the next big upcoming issue as one that struck a real chord. I have to say, and I may say more about this in the comments that I make later, that the rise in very strongly nationalistic feeling is something that I think anyone who keeps an eye on China through social media, official statements, just direction of political travel, really would find it difficult to dismiss. Clearly, there are different aspects to nationalism. I will say something about that as well. It's not necessarily clearly the same thing as xenophobia, but it does have this very strong and active and sometimes quite confrontational sense of what China is supposed to be. And it does seem that the concentration on Taiwan in particular, the fact that it's being brought up actively by China as an issue that has to be resolved. Just last week, we saw that actually within Xi Jinping's statements on the rule of law, the adoption of a one country, two systems legal system for Taiwan, which people looking at Hong Kong might have some echoes with, was a sign of direction of travel. So I think 2021, keeping an eye on what the Taiwan question actually is, and I think both sides are perhaps a little unsure about that now, will be something to keep all of us busy.
Thank you, Rana. Joining us from Beijing is Arthur Krober. He is the founder and head of research at Gavecal Dragonomics and also a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. Welcome. What do you make of the survey that we just did?
Well, I think the results are, generally fairly unsurprising. On the economic front, I wonder, so first of all, I think that the recovery from COVID was basically last year's story. And in the coming year, probably, hopefully, the focus will shift a little bit. I tend to think that we may be underestimating the financial side of things, both on the positive and the negative. So China's financial market opening has been, one of the major economic stories the last few years. Capital inflows have been quite strong, and I think that is not, fully recognized outside the country, and I think maybe the recognition of that will become more complete in the coming year. But on the flip side, China also is subject to significant financial stress. The recovery from COVID required another investment stimulus, smaller than some of the ones that they've done in the past, but nonetheless big enough to increase the debt levels. Local government debt has kind of resurfaced as a problem. So I think a lot of the attention of the leadership on the economic front in the coming year will actually be focused on trying to manage some of the financial pressures that have arisen as a result of the ways that they've gotten out of the COVID-induced economic crisis.
Thank you. Again, we'll go into more detail later, but first I welcome Christine Schikupfer, who is a professor for contemporary China at the University of Trier, and of course known to all of us for her work at MERICS in the last couple of years, where she is now a senior associate. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you very much, Bernard. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here and to take part in this very important event and to have an audience, which is obviously also composed by a lot of experts. So it's a great opportunity to have some input here. I would like to point out two things. First of all, I found it on a positive note, honestly, also surprising that Xinjiang featured so prominently. I think that's largely also to the latest uptick in the news coverage, also obviously as somehow part of the EU China investment agreement, forced labor condition, although I'm not expecting any improvements because of that. But yeah, that featured a bit more prominently in terms of the audience vote for me than I would have expected. And the second point I would like to make is Xi Jinping will continue his grip on power. I would contend that personally. I would argue that we have seen quite a bit of inter-party opposition already concerning economic policy, the direction there, also the shift from supply-side reform to demand-side reform is something I personally contend if really Xi Jinping was so happy with that. And also, I think last year we all recall around the COVID initial phase, the blame also of the mayor of Wuhan, the city where COVID started, against the central leadership, and then the op-ed in Usher, the party journal, where Xi Jinping kind of, for the first time, also took part of the responsibility. So I would say for me personally, there are a lot more question marks in terms of how he will struggle to grip to power. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we'll take a very fast ride through these topics. We've divided this next half hour into two sections. We'll first look at the economic end of our topic, mainly with George Magnus and Arthur Krober, and then move to the political and social questions. We invite everyone to give us your questions. Please write them in the chat function in Zoom, and we'll try to come to some of them at least in about half an hour. Let's start with our economics discussion. First, of course, and for companies, that is the most important question. What is the growth outlook for China? Short term, long term, and the big buzzword this year is, of course, dual circulation. My question there is that really just a buzzword that next year is going to be forgotten, or is it a game changer and a big strategy? What do we have to expect from this? George Magnus, let's start with you.
Thank you. Well, I would agree and echo Arthur's earlier comment that in 2021, we will see a continuation of the cyclical rebound which began last year. I expect investment will still play quite a prominent role. We would expect certainly the consumer sector to do a little bit better than last year. Generally speaking, yeah, my expectation, I think the consensus view for China this year is about sort of 8% or 9% growth. I think it'll be a bit less than that, because I think the People's Bank of China and the regulators are going to take the opportunity to lean a little bit against high credit growth that was recorded in 2020, along with taking out some of the ultra accommodative bits of monetary policy and fiscal policy. And coming to terms a little bit with the rising disquiet in credit markets and bond markets as there's sort of growing questions about defaults and guarantees. But it'll be, a banner year for GDP growth, and it'll fit very nicely into the political script for the celebrations mid-year. The big question, I think, really is not so much what China does in 2021, but really over the 2020s, over the course of the decade, with well-known headwinds, which are only going to resume, which is the debt overhang, demography, productivity, the stall in reforms, and the kind of emphasis on the state sector, but also as you mentioned before, what does China really mean by dual circulation strategy and demand side reforms in the shadow of the Fifth Plenum's emphasis and shift in focus to what I would submit is a more inward focus on science and technology, self-sufficiency, and an emphasis on national security and stability maintenance, all, of course, in the wake of the deterioration in China's kind of external environment as it affects trade and technology and finance and so on. So the dual circulation strategy, of course, emphasizes both the domestic circulation and international circulation insofar as supply chains, production, competitiveness and innovation are concerned. We don't really have any strong details as yet. One imagines that many of these will be made clear in the 14th five-year plan. But I myself regard it as largely rhetorical cover for an increase in policies aimed at self-reliance and import substitution, along with a rhetoric about improving consumption, but without really confidence on my part that the government is prepared to embrace the policies necessary to do that. So we will see, I think, a lot of statements and documentation about rebalancing towards consumption. I don't think, as I said, the kind of transformation necessary to do that will be forthcoming. We will see, I think, some discussion about the contradiction that might exist between trying to get both domestic and international circulation to be kind of drivers. I think there may be a contradiction between the two. And of course, their inevitable focus will be on medium-term growth prospects, particularly in view of the stall in what we nerdily call total factor productivity, but which is the sort of elixir really for growth for countries with China's per capita income, and whether really the institutional infrastructure is going to be there or be the focus of government policy to try to create the opportunities for China to capitalize on changes which are necessary in order to sustain higher or elevated growth levels into the next decade, particularly when its potential growth is probably much, much lower than the official numbers actually suggest. So short term, in other words, I think it's kind of green light. I think it's all pretty clear, particularly as the foreign or the rest of the world begins to eventually recover, maybe in the second half of the year. Medium term, I think there are still big or bigger clouds that really hang over the outlook.
Thank you. Arthur Krober, what is your take on dual circulation? Are we still going to talk about that in a year from now?
A couple of short points to supplement George's comments, which I broadly agree with. I mean, clearly China's going to have a strong year in 2021. My expectation is that the growth for the year will be sort of artificially boosted by the fact that growth this year was very low. But if you look at the run rate of annualized GDP growth by the end of this coming year, I would expect it to be kind of in the range of 5 to 5.5%, kind of on an ongoing basis, which was where China seemed to be headed prior to the COVID pandemic. And I think the dual circulation thing, I basically agree with George. It's clearly it's a response to the trade pressure that we've seen from the United States, the blockages not only of the technological supply chain, but also attempts by the US to restrain financial flows to China. And so I think the message is essentially, on the one hand, China recognizes that it needs to stay connected to the global economy, to global markets and global supply chains, because they can't at the moment do everything on their own. But they have to sort of intensify the efforts to substitute for imported technologies and to find a sustainable source of domestic aggregate demand in case the external environment becomes even more hostile than it is. So it's a strategic orientation Everyone in China that I've talked to over the last couple of months agrees that it's very important in that sense. I think we shouldn't fuss too much about what the details are, because it's not meant to be a highly detailed program. It's meant to be an indication of a general direction. I also agree with George that they've talked a little bit about demand side reform, which has now become demand side management, which already indicates a kind of a reduction in the ambition there. And I don't think that this signals a major shift away from the traditional investment oriented direction. Just a couple of points on the longer term. I think essentially the bet that China is making right now, they're aiming, Xi Jinping wants to double the economy over the next 15 years. That implies that over that period, they have to grow on average by 4.7% a year, probably a little bit more in the early 2020s, a little less later on. As George has mentioned, there's some real problems with efficiency and productivity growth. The Chinese government is betting that they can essentially make the state operate like a giant venture capitalist, and that they're going to generate the necessary productivity growth by making gigantic investments across a whole host of high technology sectors with high future growth prospects, such as semiconductors, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, robotics, aviation, aerospace, you name it. I have some doubts about whether that can really work, but I think we also need to be a little bit respectful of the fact that over many decades, China has done things in a way that sort of normal economists like me look at and say, well, that probably can't work. And they've achieved pretty spectacular results. And if there's any country that is able to make this kind of nationwide venture capital approach to growth work, it's probably China, because it's really the only country with the scale and the proven comparative advantage across a very wide range of manufacturing sectors to make it plausible that even if they don't succeed in all of the industrial policies that they've put out, if they succeed really well in maybe a third of them, that might be enough to pay for the losses that are generated in the other sectors and generate the kind of growth that they want. But it's not what you could call a conventional economic strategy. It very much ties into China's tradition of state-led investment as the driver of growth. And I think I share some of the skepticism about whether they can really keep that show on the road for 15 years.
Just one quick question to both of you on technology. The flip coin of the dual circulation discussion in China, in a way, is the decoupling discussion in the US and also in Europe. Is that a discussion that is going to be maintained in this year? And is that something that is actually a threat to China's growth outlook if the US and maybe also Europe withhold technologies from China and decouple? Arthur, would you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll take the first crack at that. So, my team has spent a lot of time looking at this whole question of decoupling, and the basic conclusion is it's easy to talk about and really, really hard to do. So there's been enormous pressure from the Trump administration to compel US companies to reduce their exposure to China. It has basically had zero impact, a little bit of impact at the margin. But fundamentally, US companies, and I think this holds for a large swath of European companies as well, view China as essential as a market. It's one of the few places where you really have high growth in a broad range of sectors. If you want to be at the cutting edge of technology in a lot of sectors, you have to participate in China because that's where the activity is. It isn't necessarily the case that Chinese firms are leading the innovation, but a lot of the sort of dynamism is occurring within the Chinese market. And China remains unparalleled as an efficient production base. And COVID actually underscored that. So China's rapid recovery from COVID, the fact that they got the pandemic under control, unlike the US and Europe, unlike many other Asian countries, and that they focused on getting the supply side of the economy back on track very early, really by the end of May, most of the executives I talk to say, they're very happy operating in China because it's an excellent environment. There's been a lot of pressure on U.S. institutions to reduce financing to China, but capital inflows have hit record levels. Why? Because China has managed its economy well. It's managed to keep its interest rates relatively high. So if you're looking for yield, there isn't, you invest in European bonds, you lose money. It's a negative yield. There's negative real yield on most sovereign bonds in the world, except in China. China's equity market provides a lot of opportunities for growth. So again, I think the political ideology of decoupling has run up against some very large practical barriers in terms of the interests of the material interests of industrial companies and of financial institutions. And I don't think that's going to go away. So I think China is clearly in a little bit of a defensive mode, and there are some vulnerabilities in terms of loss of access to US semiconductors and so forth. So that will continue, I think, to be a dance. But my overall conclusion is that the interdependency between China and the West on most of these technological fields, and increasingly in finance, is so deep and so complex that pulling it apart comprehensively is almost impossible. Little bits of it can be pulled apart, but even that comes at very high costs. It's likely to be resisted by many, not just by China, but by many companies in Europe and the United States that have a huge vested interest in the China market.
Thank you. George.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that, and Arthur and his colleagues have been quite loquacious, shall I say, and iterative about these issues in a very interesting way. But I think there are. The interdependence is really important, and nowhere more so maybe than particularly in the context of coupling and decoupling. And we look at the finance sector as well, where notwithstanding attempts in I was going to say the last US administration, it's not quite the last yet, but notwithstanding attempts to try to weaponize finance, American financial companies are kind of lining up to get into China or to get more licenses to do more business there. So there is this kind of contradiction really between the politics of decoupling and the attempts, which obviously the United States, perhaps others, want to make to try to contain or withhold technology from China, and the desire on the part of US financial companies and manufacturing companies in Europe and the United States to that have businesses in China to continue to be there and to do more. Plus, of course, in the kind of Chamber of Commerce surveys that we've seen, both in the EU and in the United States instances, there is a kind of a slightly more upbeat tone, I would say, at least in some of the opinions voiced by companies about intellectual property protection, about the court system, about bankruptcy proceedings, and things that traditionally companies have kind of complained about. So I was going to say breaking that tie. I don't really mean breaking the tie, but actually the wedge really between the way companies view doing their business in China or wanting to do their business in China, and the politics of trying to restrain them from doing so, I think is it's a big problem. If there is an issue looking out over the medium term issues, I think they are much more likely to be in particular sectors where China may have relative disadvantages. They've been trying to get semiconductor microprocessor industry up and running for the best part of a decade, throwing billions of dollars behind it, and still only manufacture, I think your numbers, Arthur, are right, 15 or 16% of total demand. So there are important sectors where I think the United States and EU can basically crimp China's progress and make things very difficult. But ultimately, to be honest, I think the big issue for me really was summed up by Jack Ma's statement in the infamous speech he gave that ostensibly got him into trouble, although you could say that it was brewing long before that. And he said, to innovate without taking risk is to strangle innovation. I think the problem with innovation without taking risk actually lies at the heart of the problem for China, and where we spoke about this a little bit earlier just now in different contexts, but where state control is prized more than market efficiency and bold action, and where political insecurity precludes open discussion and bottom-up change. I think these are going to be big problems, which which key kind of constraints in the technology relationship, rather than any kind of general trading or ubiquitous rules. Actually, will those are the things which are going to be the clinch points.
Thank you. Like Miko mentioned in the beginning, there's going to be much more on this issue in the report coming out tomorrow by the EUCCC and MERICS. Let's now turn to the political and social side of the discussion and bring in Rana Mitter and Christine Schikupfer. By the way, we do have a number of questions coming in through the chat. If you see my head going back and forth like a chicken, I'm trying to read the questions. We'll come to them very soon. The pro tip would be, the shorter your question is, the more likely I'm going to be able to read it and pose it. But now to Rana and Christine and China's domestic politics. Let's again look at the question that we had in the Mentimeter survey, the biggest domestic challenges for Xi Jinping. The choice of topics there was, of course, the border and domestic issues, Taiwan, Hong Kong, domestic in China's definition. What other domestic challenges does Xi Jinping face this year? Christine, would you want to go first?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. Well, if I try to put myself in the shoes of Xi Jinping, which is quite a courageous or daring thing to do, obviously, I would argue that for him, on a personal level, he has to prove his success, at least until next year, short term. So he's also able to extend his term as president, which I again would say is not a given. There has to be a reason also for the people who would back this to be able to back it. And interestingly, I would say to prove his success, he to some degree has to manage all the challenges. Obviously, the most important one to the COVID recovery, the stabilization of the economy, secure the financial sector. I mean, the investigation and the allegations, the control of companies like Alibaba and the IT tech giants also point to that. They mention that also Xi Jinping, they want to prove excessive expansion of capital. So a control, so he has to manage all of this, but I think he doesn't want to solve the root cause of all these issues also, because for him personally, to some degree, this balance of, keeping a bit of a crisis, a challenge mode helps him to prove you need me, a strong guy for the next years to manage all this. And to some wider extent also, then he could argue, you guys need not only domestic China, but the world needs the CCP as the sole power in place to manage all this. So it will be interesting to see. I think he will probably go for a kind of balance also between his goal he should have qua office, to this year, obviously, to manage the celebration, to propagate the success. Now China is a moderately well-off society. They managed to improve the livelihood. This has been the historical task of the party state. But also, again, on the other hand, to make sure there's enough reason left for him to be able to continue, and also and I think this is the overall priority for him, to maintain his grip to power and to expand the control he wants to have for the party overall circles of domestic politics and also economy, and increasingly, also globally. I will leave it at that as a first take, and curious to listen to Rana, what he would like to. What's your point on this?
Rana, straight to you.
Sure, thanks. Well, thanks, Christian. I mean, again, I think you've hit very, very clearly on the head many of the key issues. In terms of talking about the challenges to Xi Jinping and the CCP, I'll stay away from the obvious economic issues because George and Arthur have dealt with them so ably. And instead, I think I'll summarize it as overall being a problem of messaging. The way in which in 2021, the CCP as a whole and Xi Jinping himself has to create a set of messages that not only defines the moment now in 2021, but actually the story as it's going to unfold in the next few years. And in a moment or so, I think we're going to get to some of the issues to do with the anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, but I'll just say a couple of things that relate to slightly different issues. The first one actually is to pick up very much on Christian's point about succession. My own feeling is that what do any of us know who aren't on the inside? But I don't see any signs that Xi as such is in a particularly difficult or dangerous personal position. I suspect he'll get his extension of term. The problems of a year ago when it looked like COVID was going to undermine the country have clearly, in those short-term senses, been overcome. But I think that, we have an awful lot of governors, an awful lot of party secretaries, an awful lot of aspirants of the next 2-3 generations coming up through the system. Those of us who, find it very interesting to talk to younger and middle-aged members of the CCP, I tend to be struck both actually by, at some levels, the genuine positivity of the enterprise they think they're in, and a sense of perhaps lack of knowledge of what the next stages are supposed to be. In other words, if Xi Jinping, as looks likely, is going to have at least one more term and maybe, go on beyond that, what does that mean for succession? What does that mean, not necessarily for succession at the very top, which is a rather specific sort of deal, but in terms of the power structures that emerge beyond that? And talking about a system which everything stays the same except for the person at the top is quite a complex story to tell. So I'll be intrigued to see how and if that gets done. I have a feeling, looking at the kind of things which come out in usher, the main theoretical journal of the party, and a lot of turn towards a particular sort of Marxist language about struggle and contradiction and so forth, that this is a linguistic narrative exercise that is only just beginning. A couple of other points on those sorts of elements. I think that on COVID, I wouldn't underestimate, first of all, the likelihood that actually the continued vigilance of the whole country in terms of working out where it's going to pop up next. And if you think about what's happened in the last 3 months, there was a bit up in Dongbei, and then now it's in Shijiazhuang, and then, there was a bit in the south appears to be free at the moment, but it has reoccurred. Hong Kong, of course, has had all sorts of elements popping back and forth. At one level, China is, I think, better able to cope with this on the grounds that it is a society that for 70 years plus 100 years has been living through almost permanent crisis of one sort or another. The kind of dull stability which all of us who lived in what we thought was the boring old West have valued for many decades has never existed in China, and therefore to some extent they're more primed for it. But as we all know, and without pushing the metaphor too far, when adrenaline is running through your system all the time without cease, it also does quite a lot to your basic metabolism. And in this particular case, there's another factor, and again, without going too far down the medical line, but COVID has one other effect. I think it's very unlikely in the year 2021 as a whole, probably going into 2020, that there'll be that much possibility either for any very significant number of foreigners to be going into China to join Arthur in his Beijing hideout, or indeed for many Chinese to be able to make regular and predictable journeys out as well. Yes, we know the holiday business is coming back and people are going on corridors to Thailand and so forth, but it's very unpredictable. It keeps changing, not least because the outside world still clearly hasn't got a hold on the virus. And therefore, I think the overall effects of being a much more isolated society in which there is now yet another unpredictable factor in the midst of a whole variety of existing unpredictable factors, that will have more effect, I think, on the necessity of the party and of Xi to tell a different sort of story. They've had the triumphalist story that took them up to December 2020. That's fine. I think they need a new story to hang on to the control of the narrative.
100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. To what extent is this going to influence the messaging that we are going to see this year? Rana?
Okay, well, let me just pop back directly to that briefly, if I may, and then Kristen, I'm sure, will have plenty to say on this. I think it'll come as no surprise, but it's worth pointing out that I think that this is going to be ideologically an anniversary which, despite the fact that technically it's of a party and not of a country, is going to be very centered on the idea of nationalism. And, 没有共产党,没有新中国, no CCP, no New China, will be the underlying message. I think several things will come from it. One is overall a great deal of triumphalism about how far China has come. And to some extent, I think that is something we shouldn't necessarily begrudge China. We know the stories, they've always become a cliche, X hundreds of millions brought out of poverty, from zero to tech innovator, second biggest economy in the world. Those are very, very impressive stories that I think, the Chinese Communist Party has some right to tell. But I think what should disturb us all, and I've said this directly to folks I've spoken to in Beijing in the last few weeks, is one element which, and again, Arthur may be in a better position to talk about this than I am because he's in China, and my contact with Chinese television is more based on watching it online. But there's an awful lot of militarization of the message going on, and there's an awful lot of messaging about Taiwan in particular, and that is something that was actually noted on the Mentimeter, and glad to be able to bring it up again as an issue. The reason I find this combination of things problematic is that it's not immediately obvious to me what it means. I mean, obviously in the wider sense, Taiwan is supposed to be reunified, and we all know that Xi and the CCP are very keen. This should happen sooner rather than later, and we've all pored over those documents that say things like, why was the word peaceful removed from unification in the preparatory meeting, the MPC earlier in 2020. All of those rather specific granular things. But I think we need to sort of step back and say, but what is the intention behind all of this? I think most analysts would say that actually, so far, China is not being revved up, as far as we can see, directly for the idea that this is going to be a kind of great military victory for China, mostly because many analysts would say that would be an extremely dubious proposition, but also because it doesn't seem to fit into a wider narrative other than, we want Taiwan reunified and it's going to be reunified. It, of course, also has done absolutely no groundwork to prepare the Chinese public for the fact that Taiwan, which many, middle-class people have visited, is a very different sort of society. And the talk which we've had, as I mentioned briefly last week, from the committee discussing legal change about one country, two systems being used as a legal basis for reunification of Taiwan, clearly will be very unconvincing to anyone in Taiwan. That goes without saying. But actually, more to the point, isn't if it's a strategy that's not being worked through, a bit like dual circulation, then it's a piece of rhetoric without much strategy behind it. If it's genuinely meant, if anyone really in policymaking circles in Beijing thinks that pointing to Hong Kong and saying, Taiwan, this is coming for you guys, is going to be an effective strategy, then I think that this suggests that an awful lot of input into policymaking is needed to actually make this more than halfway convincing. And all of the TV advertisements with the nuclear missiles and all the other exciting things that we see on that front, I think is not a terribly good sign. So I think we hope that the kind of saber rattling strategy is perhaps there to kind of make people feel warm and macho rather than actually being a direction of travel in terms of strategy. But I think we will see an awful lot more of it during this coming year, 2021.
Thank you. Christine, I'd be interested in your views on the centennial anniversary of the Communist Party, of course, but I'd like to add another aspect, and here we're moving towards the questions that were posed in the chat. How about internal criticism? How much is there? How willing is the party, in your view, to really follow the path set out by Xi Jinping? There's of course been the Caixia discussion. What do you see in this respect?
Yes, thank you. Very important point. So first of all, also adding to what Rana just said, I think clearly this celebration this year is going to be the central focus for now. And there will be a lot of, communication efforts, propaganda efforts to make sure this is also adequately displayed. But at the same time, I already found it quite interesting that Xi Jinping is also shifting a little bit the attention towards the next goal. He kind of said, well, to be a more modern, developed society, we should aim for 2035, and then actually 2050 is even more important. So he's, on the one hand, trying to point ahead without giving any clear roadmap. And I think that's indeed crucial, what Rana has just said. Also in terms of, and I now pick up your question, or the question from the audience, Bernard, in terms of to keep the party united, on the one hand, also to have a certain willingness to follow, to ensure discipline, to ensure control with a variety of measures, but also on the other hand, to unleash, partly which we have seen before Xi Jinping much more, and people are now also saying this is also part of the problem, to unleash again the dynamics of the willingness, and Arthur and George have both talked about it, by private entrepreneurs to take risks, to innovate, but also by local cadres to really take on responsibility, to feel again they could make a difference by adapting general policy guidelines to local conditions. This whole issue of policy experimentation has been very much suppressed under Xi Jinping, with all this top-down kind of guidance. And I do think this is also Cai Xia, the party school member who has recently fled to the US, and we're kind of saying, well, 70-80% within the party are, due to various reasons, are skeptical that really this top-down, focused on one-man leadership is the best way to move forward in terms of tackling the problems, because it doesn't incentivize the elites really to take on responsibility, to be rather afraid if they might be linked up in another political or kind of corruption case. And it also suppresses dissenting voices, which might be indeed important for developing the best solutions. And again, I agree, Rana, that at the short term, looking at it now, the kind of political crisis in terms of decision making, the criticism by the mayor of Wuhan, which I found astonishing that he's still in place. He pointed, he said, well, this was the responsibility of central China, of Beijing. This was not us making the delayed decision. He's still in place. So I think this is not yet solved. And I'm not sure if people are really convinced of, also within the party, that this top-down suppression of dissenting voices, disincentivizing cadres to take responsibility, is really the best sustainable way to move forward, especially if that's also what Xi Jinping promised. It's not only about growth, it's about sustainability, it's about life quality. It's much more than just, eradicating poverty. That's one issue, but it's a lot more now at stake, I think, for the future of China, also from the perspective of many Chinese.
Thank you. We have about 8 minutes to go. So I'll pick 4 questions from the chat and throw them at each of you and ask you to give very brief answers. Christine, starting with you, there's several questions about Xinjiang. There's been a lot of Western criticism about the situation in Xinjiang. There has been very little criticism heard from the Muslim world. Do you see anything in that regard, or how do you see the Xinjiang issue playing out in 2021?
Well, it's obviously an issue that has gained, again, a little more of international, although mostly attention within liberal democracies. But, within, for example, Turkey, on and off, obviously, there has been also, because of the connection, concern about Uyghur people. Also, to some extent in Central Asia, at least from some parts of also the Muslim minorities there has been some concern also. But yeah, this is obviously something which is very much kind of bothering Beijing in terms of international reputation. Now with this new report that they kind of just put out against a research of Adrian Zenz, kind of stipulating there are other reasons for the decrease of population in Xinjiang, that, for example, Uyghur women voluntarily, spontaneously agreed to certain measures for sterilization. I think that shows that they are aware of the reputational damage that this is causing within the wider international community.
Rana Mitter, we have a question here directly for you. Someone asking about China-India relations and referring to your book about the war between China and Japan. So let's make it a little broader. A question about China's position in the region and its relationship to its neighbors. What do you think are the most important developments that we should be looking out to in the course of the year?
Thanks. Great question. I think that what we are likely to see in 2021 in terms of China's neighbors is something that we've already seen revving up even within the last few weeks, which is an attempt in most cases to try and warm relations with various neighbors before the Biden administration gets installed, assuming that the oncoming coup in Washington, D.C. doesn't actually take effect. And of course, at least in the intention of Tony Blinken and his team, to find ways to pick up relationships and alliances which were rather neglected during the years of the Trump administration. That's a partial statement because, of course, China is also, again, slightly to the bemusement of those who are trying to work out some kind of consistent strategy. At least some of the neighbors in the region, such as Australia, are being basically squeezed very, very hard. And, you know, the kind of strategic lessons being seen from the bullying of Australia, whether it's the relative lack of power that another power has, even when it's signed a full trade agreement with China, as in the case of JAFTA, or indeed the picking out of one particular regional neighbor in the context of the wider strategy, still remains to be seen. But I think overall, I would expect that there would be attempts to try and find some kind of warm relationship with North Korea, which is beginning to show itself as an issue again. I think it's already clear that trying to woo as many ASEAN countries as possible before the Americans get back in the game properly is also part of the current strategy. And I think that India is sort of one of those issues that will always be sort of friction on the border. I always expect that it will never, I mean, last year was a bit exceptional and there were actual deaths, but I expect that India is one of those problems that is neither going to ever be resolved. So the great sort of vision that some have of the India-China combo coming together and dominating Asia, I think is very unlikely. But the likelihood also actually that it's going to be a primary area of conflict, certainly in comparison with problems in with North Korea or with Taiwan, or possibly even in terms of the kind of wider rim involving Japan and other US allies. India, I think, is in a much lower tier of potential conflict, unless the Quad arrangements with other allies come to pass. But even those always seem to be more in rhetoric than they are in reality. But we'll see if that changes in the next few months.
Thank you. George and Magnus, let's turn to you. There's a number of questions about the financial system, financial regulation, the role of Hong Kong as a financial hub in the region and for China. What do you see in terms of the markets and the financial system in this year?
Well, there are lots of different sort of cross currents there, aren't there? Really. So if we just leave kind of domestic financial stability to one side, I mean, if this is a question really about China's kind of external financial relations, so to speak, I mean, I think the Hong Kong side of this actually is something that I give a kind of a lot of thought to at the moment, because I don't really know. I mean, what I think I do know is that China still values the Hong Kong relationship, the financial relationship, quite a lot. I mean, it accounts for about a third of the equity capital raising by Chinese companies, about 2/3 of the offshore bond issuance of China, which obviously includes SOEs, local governments, and private companies, and about 3/5 of inward and outward foreign direct investment. So there's never been any issue or any question really about the significance of the financial relationship of Hong Kong for China. The question really is the degree to, well, two questions really is. One is the degree to which China wants to kind of dilute that into the Greater Bay Area and also to Shanghai and other free trade zones or other kind of centers of finance that it's trying to nurture. The speed with which it wants to do that, which I mean, we have to assume that probably will take place over some period of time, but the pace may be determined by things that are beyond its control. So, we have to make guesses really about the degree to which the United States, may actually ramp up the sanction regime against individuals in Hong Kong deemed to be implementing the national security law, or indeed whether actions may be taken against using the dollar, obviously, as the kind of weapon against financial institutions. The other issue really is whether at some point there's some sort of capital flight from Hong Kong as Hong Kong residents, which may include obviously mainland Chinese people as well, decide that they want to get their money out of Hong Kong. And then, notwithstanding the fact that the HKMA has a kind of a long and illustrious history of successfully defending the peg, I mean, we have to bear in mind, it has a financial asset base which is 9 times its GDP in Hong Kong, a pegged exchange rate, and it, a government that may be not a new government, but a government that more directly now would be much more reticent, perhaps, about accepting the consequences of defending the peg should that ever arise. So I think there will be a lot of focus really on Hong Kong's financial stability as a sort of kind of a satellite really of China's main financial system, as well as, of course, on the main things that we kind of think about a lot, which really are, the areas of opening up, which the Chinese government has actually made towards already American financial companies and might to European financial companies if the CAI the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, ever sees the light of day. So I think these are the kind of big two sort of external financial issues which will keep us busy and thinking about over the next year or so.
Thank you, George Magnus. The last question, and a particularly juicy one for Arthur Krober. Several people have been asking about your take on the Ant Financial and Jack Ma issue. Now, we'd like to hear about that for about 1 hour, but please give us the 1 minute in a nutshell version. And please turn on your mic.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, that is a juicy and complicated question. I will do my best. So I think there are essentially 2 strands here. There's what you could call the technocratic strand and the control strand. And the technocratic strand was, so I think, some very legitimate concerns that the financial regulators had about the potential systemic impact of Ant Financial's activity. And without getting too complicated, I think the regulators, it appears, did not really understand how big the entire microfinance sector was until they read the Ant prospectus. And the evidence for this is that in its prospectus, Ant revealed that it was doing about twice as much micro-lending each year as the PBOC claimed was going on in the entire country at that time. So clearly the regulators were unaware of the rapidity with which Ant had expended its activities and the ways in which by helping to originate loans and then securitizing them or passing them off onto other lenders, Ant was actually doing things that were very similar to the kinds of practices in the United States circa 2005 that led to the financial crisis. So there was, I think, brewing a very legitimate desire by financial regulators to get a handle on a potentially very disruptive kind of financial innovation. And then the pace of that regulation was accelerated by the fact that Jack Ma got up and gave a very intemperate speech in which he directly criticized the leadership, got Xi Jinping very angry. And then I think what that triggered was not just a desire to punish Jack Ma personally, but a recognition by the political leadership in the CCP that these internet companies, not just Alibaba, but Tencent and some others, had gotten very big. They had not really been subject to any material kind of restraint or regulation, either in an economic or political sense, for many years. It's actually pretty astonishing. And so since the CCP is always desirous of squeezing out any even potential or incipient new power bases that are separate from the party, I think what you had was a trigger for a more comprehensive reminder to the big internet companies about who's boss. And I think that's what's behind this kind of broader anti-monopoly regulation that we're seeing here. So, and I think that, just to conclude on this, I think that the people who are executing these policies understand that on the one hand, they have to send a political message that these companies are subordinate to CCP leadership. That has to be very firmly communicated. They do have to not permit the kind of financial risk that Ant looked like it was going to bring into the system. But at the same time, they have to allow space for these companies to continue doing their thing. They're very innovative, they're very beneficial to consumers, and they actually serve a lot of Communist Party governance goals in terms of incorporating rural households into goods networks and so forth. And so I think it will be very interesting to watch over the coming year how they balance those two objectives of asserting greater political control over these big internet companies, while at the same time allowing them sufficient space to perform the functions that even most people in the party recognize are extremely important, in fact, crucial to China's development and growth objectives.
Thank you very much. This has been a fantastic curtain raiser for what is going to be a very interesting year. I very much thank all four panelists. I thank everyone in the audience who posed questions. I apologize for not being able to refer more of them to our panel, but please do go on discussing about these questions in the chat or on Twitter or LinkedIn. We don't only have an all-star panel here, we also obviously have an all-star audience with a lot of good views and insights on these questions. We'll now take a 3-minute break before we go on to the next panel. So you have 3 minutes, and then Lucrezia Poggetti and Jacob Hankevera are going to welcome you for the second panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, Lucrezia, ciao.
Hi. Welcome back to panel number 2 of our MERICS China Forecast 2021. We will be discussing Europe's China strategies for 2021, as well as economic and political relations and challenges ahead in EU-China relations. My name is Lucrezia Poggetti. I'm an analyst of EU-China relations here at MERICS in Berlin. And what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes before I'm joined by an excellent panel, which will be moderated by Politico's Jakob Hanke Vela, I will be presenting the key findings of our forecasting survey on EU-China relations. This is part of an annual forecasting exercise that we do at MERICS. And this year, we collected 170 responses from European China experts. This includes both members of the research community and practitioners from several industries, including government, private companies, and more. And this year, we also opened our survey to members of the wider international public, and roughly 1,000 members of the general public took part in the survey. So let's get started, and colleagues can please move on to the next slide. Thank you very much. I would like to kick us off by looking at some predictions for the overall trajectory, politically and economically, of EU-China relations in 2021. The main takeaway from this slide, which I find quite interesting, is the general sense, which is shared by both members of the general public and of the expert community, that economic relations will remain stable despite worsening political ties. In a way, this also shows you a reflection potentially of what the EU own approach to China policy has been, which is of compartmentalizing those areas of cooperation and competition in their relationship with China. And this is something that we saw right again with the beginning of the new year, when obviously the conclusion in principle of negotiations for a comprehensive agreement on investment was followed right away by a call on January 6th by the European Union to China to release immediately the 53 former pro-democracy lawmakers in Hong Kong. So try and keeping business and politics separate, and we will have time to discuss during the panel whether this approach is still feasible and suitable in 2021. A second aspect of this slide that I find quite interesting is the split that you can see in economic relations between, if you look at that group of people who do not think their relations will remain stable, we have two camps of people who think that relations will either deteriorate or improve economically. And I find this quite interesting to look at along with the next slide, if we can move on, please. If colleagues, thank you very much. Indeed, China's coercive diplomacy was ranked by respondents as the #1 concern for EU-China relations in 2021. And this is important for what I just said in terms of the economic relationship as well. If we look at what's happening between China and Australia lately, it is obvious that political issues do have the potential to impact economic cooperation as well. And this does point to the need to balance probably our interest in greater market access in China with economic sovereignty and resilience policies. And when it comes to that kind of assertive, sometimes aggressive, diplomatic stance that we've grown accustomed to from China over the course of 2021, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has already clarified when he laid out the diplomatic priorities for China to party-state media on January 2nd, that China does not plan to back away from warfare diplomacy because it needs, as he said, to stand its firm against those who are not so friendly to China. But let's move on to the next slide and let's take a look at the cooperation agenda and what this continued partner-rival dualism means for EU-China cooperation. As you can see, there is general skepticism about the prospects for any breakthroughs, really, between the EU and China on their cooperative agenda. There is, though, some hope related to investment. And I should clarify for transparency that we received most of our answers to the survey in December, before actually we heard the news of the EU and China planning to conclude in principle those negotiations on the investment agreement. And this is coupled with some hope on climate as well, which this year actually became basically the number one issue area, which is an improvement from last year when climate was not so high on the agenda, at least in our survey responses. But I'd like to focus on two issues specifically: climate, we've just mentioned, but also COVID-19 vaccine research and distribution. Both climate and the coronavirus pandemic are very often mentioned by both Chinese and EU leaders and officials as areas where cooperation between the EU and China is possible and necessary. Well, as you can see, the result on COVID-19 cooperation is quite striking, with basically no one saying that this is an area that will see any breakthrough between the EU and China. Whereas, again, some optimism about climate, which might reflect last year's carbon neutrality pledges, as well as the priorities for 2021, with two big UN conferences on climate and biodiversity happening in Kunming and Glasgow. Next slide, please. Right. Moving on to the broader geopolitical landscape, these results will not come as a surprise to many of you. There are very high expectations for a revival of transatlantic relations in 2021. This is, again, not surprising, but quite striking, especially if we compare this result with the responses from last year, when in fact, the difference in percentage point between China and the US was not that substantial, whereas this year we have almost 90% of European China experts saying that the EU and its member states will draw closer to the US, and more than 80% of the members of the general public agreeing with that assessment. This is obviously relevant for China policy as well, as we know. And we know that both sides have already expressed an interest in collaborating on China policy, which is not going to be without obstacles, but we will have more time to discuss this with our other panelists. Moving on to the next slide, please. We obviously don't only expect a new American administration. Another big event that all people across the world really will be looking at in the second half of this year is going to be Germany's federal elections. So we asked respondents of our survey whether they think there will be any changes in Germany's approach to relations with China with a change in government after Angela Merkel. This is probably one of the few slides where we see some differences between the responses given by the wider public and the experts. In general, there is an agreement that Germany will not get softer on China. A bit more of an expectation on the side of the experts, almost 50%, that Germany will get tougher on China, depending obviously on the results of the elections, who gets elected, and the composition of the final ruling coalition. And quite a few others saying that things will stay very much the same. So thinking that the elections won't have an impact after all. And I'd like to conclude with one final slide to sort of look quickly at the way forward. We started off by discussing the partner-rival dualism between the EU and China, and in the Eurozone approach to China, which is very much a continuation of last year's trajectory. Something that might be different this year is the fact that the EU has developed and is continuing to develop new tools and strategies that are also going to be relevant for China policy. And we are listing some of this in these slides, as you can see, and asking which of this will be particularly important that the EU takes as next steps in relations with China, our respondents gave priority to human rights sanctions for China's behavior in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, and the diversification of supply chains away from China, which is going to be quite interesting to discuss, again, especially as we try to negotiate better market access to China. But with that, I would like to close and give the floor to our moderator, Jakob Hanke Vela from Politico, and look forward to joining my co-panelists for a discussion on EU-China in the year ahead. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lucrezia. Everybody. There's something strange with the camera. I'm not sure. Yeah, this must be something from the technical side. I will go on. Thanks, Lucrezia. You mentioned really interesting points, especially how the respondents list as first concerns human rights and China's coercive diplomacy, but also list human rights as the top agenda item that the EU should focus on for 2021. And I will, of course, discuss with the panelists if that's also your view. You also mentioned the compartmentalization, which we will discuss in a minute. We have a really great panel today to discuss all these issues. Reinhard Bütikofer, who's a member of the European Parliament for the Greens, Lucrezia, who you've all just met, who's an analyst at MERICS, Plamen Tonchev, who's the head of the Asia unit at the Institute of International Economic Relations in Athens, and Gunnar Wiegand, who heads the Asia Pacific division at the EU's diplomatic service, so that's the EEAS in Brussels. We will discuss all these issues on compartmentalization, human rights, etc. in a second, but since I'm a journalist, I want to start with the news, which is, of course, the China-EU investment agreement. Yesterday, Frank Riester said that the EU will not wait for China to ban forced labor before ratifying this agreement. And of course, Reinhard Bütikofer, you disagreed with that view very strongly. Do you think the Parliament will have to wait?
Clearly, I think the junior minister from the French government went beyond his area of competency. It's up to the council to sign the agreement, but it's up to the parliament to ratify. And as far as I can tell, the mood in the parliament, and this is across party lines, is very critical with regard to the issue of forced labor in particular, and more widely, the issue of labor protections and ILO core conventions. So I think the minister was jumping to a conclusion, and it may be the case that some governments might want to give orders to the European Parliament, possibly also at the behest of the Chinese leadership. But the European Parliament, just before Christmas, took a very strong stance on these issues, in particular, voted a resolution on Xinjiang and forced labor with 604 in favor and just 20 opposed. So I'm not expecting colleagues to budge on that issue.
Gunnar Wiegand, I cannot see you, but are you with us? I think Gunnar Wiegand is not yet with us. Hopefully, the technical issues will be solved. In the meantime, Plamen, what is your view on this? Should the EU pass this agreement, sign this agreement, at least from the Council side, because from the Parliament it will be difficult, as you just heard, before China bans forced labor?
Well, I think that first of all, it'll be a lengthy process, one way or another. So I don't think that this issue will be solved or even tackled tomorrow early in the morning. It may take months. In fact, I understand that they're looking at 2022 as the year of concluding all these negotiations and signing and ratifying the CAI, possibly under the French presidency. And that's part of the informal agreement, I understand. I don't think that China will budge on the issue of forced labor, and there are indications, including statements of prominent Chinese scholars, that China is unlikely to budge on the issue of forced labor. So to me, this seems, this statement of the French minister seems like an attempt at buying some time until we come up with some wiser decisions and better thoughts.
Mm-hmm. I just got message from the organizers that Gunnar Wiegand is not able to connect, but they are working on it, trying to get him in. So in the meantime, we will continue the discussion. Lucrezia, you mentioned that the EU's strategy with China, explicitly or implicitly, is a compartmentalization strategy. So business on one side and human rights on the other side. What I wonder is, will this still work in 2021, considering what we have seen in Australia, for example, last year, which also signed a trade deal with China, but then had to find out that it didn't deliver because China used trade as a leverage for political questions. So what is your view on this?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and one that the European Union and European governments really will have to deal with over the course of this year. As the debate that started off right away with the end in principle of negotiations on the investment agreement shows, the EU is under considerable pressure to show that it puts some substance to its rhetoric about China as a systemic rival, which is something that obviously was not very much visible in the moment the European governments rushed to conclude talks in December on the investment agreement. What I think is going to be really crucial, also by looking back again at the results of our survey, is that the EU takes some concrete steps on the rivalry agenda with China to show that cooperation goes ahead, but it does with more of a nuanced approach, while the EU still takes steps to also tackle the other challenges in the relationship with China. So we saw from the results human rights sanctions. This is a new tool that the EU approved just in December. Supply chain diversification. This is a crucial component of the Indo-Pacific strategies that some EU member states have come up with over the past few months. And there are, to be fair, more tools and strategies that the EU has developed over the course of 2020. We have an investment screening mechanism now in place. So obviously, there are quite a few actions that the EU can take to show that its rhetoric about China as a systemic rival is relevant.
Reinhard, the problem of compartmentalization, of course, goes both ways. There are things where the EU just needs to work with China, such as climate change. Do you think that it will be able to work with China if at the same time it gets tougher on things like forced labor and human rights?
Well, of course, we're extremely interested to work with China on climate change, but it is one thing to take practical steps of cooperation, and it's another thing to just hope that the Chinese will play ball on that front, just because it is so necessary that we would come up with concerted action. That does not necessarily imply that that the Chinese government is following that logic. And when I look at the divergence between Xi Jinping's announcements at the Nations General Assembly and what we learn upcoming 5-year plan with regard to in particular coal, then I'm not sure we should not first of all begin understanding that this is also an arena in which cooperation is moderated by competition and even rivalry. So I guess you are right that compartmentalization is not the right approach, but even where we believe we should cooperate, we have to cooperate as systemic rivals. You cannot separate these cooperation opportunities that we pursue from the basic fact that this is a real battle.
Mm-hmm. So basically, it's also in China's interest to cooperate on climate change, but that doesn't preclude us from taking measures that we think are important to defend basic rights.
Well, why would we sort of relent on pursuing human rights issues? Why would we relent? Why would we give up on raising issues concerning Xinjiang or Hong Kong or Taiwan, just in order to do China the favor of allowing them to cooperate with us on climate? I don't think that climate issues are interest. If they mean what they say, they should work on climate regardless.
Okay. Thanks. Plamen, we've talked shortly about the China investment agreement, but while we wait for Gunnar, maybe we can talk a bit more about this, especially the aspects that are not in the agreement. A lot of people were surprised that investment protection is not in there. Do you think this still makes the deal interesting economically for the EU? And one question that I haven't been able to find out is, will this deal at the same time cancel all the bilateral agreements that EU countries have that protect investment and that have ISDS?
Right. Well, let me say that first of all, we haven't seen the full text of the agreement yet, have we? At least I haven't. Maybe some people have. But I'm sure that once the text has been published, it will have to be studied thoroughly, and it should be assessed properly. And I believe that there should be a debate, an EU-wide debate, because everybody will be affected by this large-scale agreement with China. Secondly, I understand from leaks and publications in the media that there may be lack of clarity regarding dispute settlement mechanisms. I'm not clear on that, so I'm keen. I'm really eager to see the text of the agreement. So yes, there are question marks, and we will have to be patient. Hopefully, in a few days, we will see the text itself. And then we can discuss, and I suppose that will be a really useful, meaningful, and much needed discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Can I come in just to provide a bit of information to your answer to your question, Jakob?
That would be great.
Yes. As regards the pre-existing 26 BITs that all the member states, with the exception of Ireland, now have with the Chinese, they will not be superseded as regards investment protection. So as the CAI does not contain any language on that, all the BITs will continue to be enforced until hopefully there would be a European solution.
That's a really important clarification, which I also wish the Commission could make. But yes, we heard a lot of questions about this from businesses, but also NGOs and other organizations. So that's really an interesting news. Reinhard, on the second issue that Plamen raised, notably the dispute settlement. Can you say a bit more about that? If it's true that in your view, the dispute settlement is not clear enough or doesn't have enough remedies?
Well, there's not just one dispute settlement mechanism foreseen in this agreement. There are several. There are dispute settlement mechanisms pertaining to what's been called the basket of level playing field issues, and then a different mechanism with regard to the sustainability chapter. And I am not ready at the moment to pass judgment on the effectiveness, but some of the provisions in particular under the mechanism regarding a level playing field, which means transparency on subsidies, forced technology transfer, or the role of SOEs. Some of the provisions that are included seem to be extremely weak in the end as regards enforcement.
Okay, so weak provisions on enforcement. We've also heard that on subsidies, especially, there's no, those are not included in the dispute settlement.
No, the EU didn't even negotiate about that. It just negotiated about transparency of subsidies, not about the subsidies themselves. And this pertains just to subsidies that are, well, not including secondary subsidies. So if SOE A subsidizes SOE B by buying at an exaggerated price, that is not covered.
Okay, great, thanks. That's also news for me. Lucrezia, as we saw in your survey, people still think that economic cooperation with China will continue. Maybe we can talk a bit about how this will change or not change with the Biden administration. I don't know. Your respondents seem to think that there would be a big change. How do you see this?
Well, I mean, what we know is that there remains a clear interest on the European side, which was stressed once again with the conclusion of the investment agreement talks to get more market access. That is not going to go away. How the new administration in the US will affect this remains to be seen. I don't know, and we can discuss also with the rest of the panel really what the prospects are, especially for this year of transatlantic coordination when it comes to China policy, because we know that we will continue to see some harsh elements of China policy on the side of the US, even with a change in administration. Now that the Democrats hold the Senate as well, they will have more leeway in doing China policy as well. But that doesn't mean that certain elements of decoupling will necessarily go away. And that's something that Europeans haven't quite been on board with. We seek supply chain diversification, but we have never really mentioned an interest in pulling out of the Chinese market and decouple right away. Then getting to the coordination more concretely, I mean, we all know there are several initiatives on the table, including those proposed by the Commission itself to the incoming Biden administration. The Biden administration has also expressed its interests in collaborating with the EU on this. Concretely, though, there are also some obstacles. Now, I'm not a trade policy expert, but obviously when it comes to US-EU trade, there are obstacles that might make things slower and more difficult. And otherwise, as we've seen again on January 6th, and those sad scenes from Capitol Hill, domestic issues will keep Biden quite busy in the beginning of his new year as president. So a lot remains to be seen in terms of the concrete elements of a transatlantic China policy.
Reinhard, the same question to you. Basically, that we always talk in sort of big principles that we want to cooperate more with the US on China, but what does it mean in practice? And can the EU even go much further in this, or are we way too diverse in our national approaches to China?
I would identify three main areas of cooperation. One obviously would be human rights. In practical terms, the Canadians and the British and the US have now tried to put in place regulation that prevents products of forced labor from Xinjiang to enter their markets. we could play along with that. That would create a strong front. Secondly, obviously, there are issues with several multilateral institutions that have been weakened by being deserted by the Trump administration, like the WHO or the Human Rights Council, where Europeans and Americans could again try to pursue a shared reform agenda, but at least have a shared presence and shared efforts. I would also assume that we can go back to cooperating more consequentially on WTO, for instance, the reform and reinvigoration of the appellate body that the Trump administration let fade away. And the third area of cooperation is certainly technology policy, where probably the pressure from the US for disruption or for disentanglement would be greatest, and where Europeans are hard put to choose where we will stand. But on the trade front, I think that it is true that we have some real issues with the Americans. We have a lot of legacy conflicts that are not easily resolved. But also, I would expect that the incoming Biden administration would show, and this is very promising, a great interest in greening trade. So using trade also as a tool for the green and climate-oriented transformation that we need to pursue. So there's ample space.
Mm-hmm. Great. Gunnar, you're coming right at the right moment. We had some technical issues connecting you, as I hear, but the important thing is you're here. We were just discussing the scope for EU-US cooperation on China. I guess what first question for you is there any EU strategy, or do we have 27 different strategies on China? And if we have 27 different, how much can we actually cooperate with the US?
Well, I think we, with two prominent observers, as my colleagues in this panel would witness, that we have achieved a significantly higher degree of convergence between the national China policies, but more importantly, the positions on what the EU's China policy should be between all of our member states over the last 2 years. And certainly the strategic outlook of spring 2019, which was formally endorsed by our heads of state and government as recently as last October, is the best proof for this, as well as the many autonomous steps which have been taken or which are under preparation in the EU, from trade defense to the 5G toolbox to investment screening. And work is underway on foreign subsidies disciplines on our internal market, but also on international procurement instrument, and therefore, as well as on a due diligence instrument for forced labor. And these are all steps which a few years ago were unthinkable. So in terms of strengthening the EU's position, of increasing our leverage to obtain reciprocity level playing field, a lot has been done. And we have a joint approach with certain key priorities, whether this is on trade investment, whether this is on climate and environment, whether this is in the field of security, of human rights. And this has been spelled out and needs to be constantly developed further. There will be a report of the High Representative to the European Council in March about the implementation of this strategic outlook approach. And more needs to be done, both in the autonomous actions, but also in the bilateral actions to implement this, and certainly in the work together with our partners. And I answer your question, yes, there's a big scope for increased transatlantic cooperation, as there is a big scope for increased cooperation with other like-minded partners with whom we share the same commitment to democracy, to market economy, but also to a functioning multilateral system. And that is where we had difficulties with the current US administration.
Right.
If I can step in, if I may.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, to link this question to the CAI, I think that Biden's election was actually a game changer. Because for 7 years, the Chinese were dragging their feet, or at least this is how they were perceived by European negotiators. And then within a month, they decided to make concessions. And suddenly we were told by the media that, okay, we are having a deal. I think it's quite clear that Biden's election made a big difference. And that clearly shows how the triangle actually plays out.
That's a really good point. Gunnar, should the EU have waited these couple of weeks, basically, for Biden to be inaugurated, as Biden himself asked, not to give them a veto, but to coordinate our actions, as the EU itself said it wanted, before concluding this political deal with China?
Should the United States have waited before concluding the phase one deal, which it included 2 years ago, after heavy unilateral tariffs were imposed by the United States, which we consider as not being in conformity with WTO rules? They have not waited for the Europeans. They have not looked for a common front, so to speak. Should our partners in ASEAN, the Australians and New Zealanders, the Japanese and the Koreans should have waited with the Regional Economic Cooperation Partnership Agreement, the RCEP, which was also shortly before the handover of the US administration concluded. I think that it is normal that everybody tries to make sure that key economic interests are preserved. We have leveled the playing field, A, for European companies with Chinese companies, because Chinese companies have a better access to our market than European companies have to their market when it comes to investments. But we also have leveled the playing field with the United States companies, because several of the concessions which the Chinese have given in this agreement were already included also in the phase one deal of the United States. The United States, of course, has never asked the Europeans to agree to this deal. So we have now a better level playing field, not only vis-a-vis the Chinese, but also in our common discussions with the United States on the best way on how to deal with challenges arising from the rise of China.
But I'm sorry, it's a bit contradictory what you're saying, because you're saying you're criticizing Trump for his unilateralist approach, and then you're saying because he did it, we should also do it.
Well, they criticize the unilateralist approach in terms of imposing unilateral tariffs. We have, of course, not done this. We have negotiated patiently over many years this agreement. This agreement should have come as no surprise to anybody, because the EU and Chinese leaders have stated already in April 2019 clearly this as the aim to finalize negotiations by the end of the year 2020, whether the president is called Trump or another president. This was repeated in June. It was repeated in September of this year at leaders' meetings, provided the substance is there. And that is the point. The substance, according to the mandate given, was achieved.
But are you saying that the substance wouldn't have been there 2 weeks later? I mean, I guess the question is, why did it have to be just before Biden's inauguration? And why did the Chinese make these concessions just before Biden's inauguration?
Because the Chinese have shared with us the aim to finalize this before the end of December. And you see the occasions when they present themselves. It is not that on the 21st of January, the world is totally different in terms of the possibility to finalize deals. It is clear that it will take several months for everybody of the Biden administration to be in place. So the fact that we have concluded an investment agreement, which is, by the way, something the United States has also for many years tried to achieve, is not in any way a hindrance for our better cooperation with the United States.
Okay.
Look, Jakob,
Reinhard?
why shouldn't we state the obvious? Decision makers in Brussels who pulled off that deal in a very hasty phase before the end of the year obviously felt that it was more important to signal to the United States that we are autonomous, as they call it, than to signal to the Chinese that the US and us want to cooperate stronger after 4 years of dissociation between the either side of the Atlantic. So geopolitically, we chose the wrong signal. And this has been a major victory for the Chinese, because why did they pose this urgent demand that it should be concluded before the end of the year? It was exactly because of the date January 20th. So we played into their cards and allowed them to create a very strong signal that even the Europeans are not willing to wait for Biden to find commonality in countering China's hegemonic ambition. I think that's a high price.
But it has not come as a surprise to you, Mr. Bütikofer, because you're one of the best informed parliamentarians looking after EU-China relations, that this has been a common aim of the two sides for a long period, which has never been contested by anyone, provided the substance is right.
And the substance wasn't there, we could argue, but maybe we should not argue this here. I don't know.
Well, it's very interesting because that's one of the main criticisms, of course, right? I mean, the Commission published a paper, leaked at first, saying that it wants to cooperate with the Biden administration on China, and less than a month later, we concluded the deal without using that joint leverage that the Commission said it wanted to build up with Biden, because it said we would be more aligned in our interest. So it's a surprising about face, right? I mean, it's a very legitimate question. Why the haste so suddenly?
I'm sorry, I don't know what is the sudden haste in negotiations of 7 years, but we have to keep in mind that people are concluding negotiations according to the parties who negotiate a deal. We will never enter into a trilateral agreement on investment or on trade between the US, China, and the European Union. So I think that this is overblown. We have, in fact, it was the initiative of the High Representative who proposed to have an EU-US deep dialogue on China. In June, it was agreed. We have agreed on the terms of reference for such a dialogue, and the first contacts have taken place. But we have now, of course, to intensify this. But we have set up the framework for this to happen with the new administration. It was done independent of which administration would be in place.
But
I would tend to disagree. But
yeah. I mean, you mentioned that the EU does not want a trilateral deal, but that's exactly what it was trying to get, right? It was in trilateral negotiations with the US and Japan to get joint rules on subsidies with China, because the argument was that China is subsidizing industries in overcapacity, and the argument was we should work with the US together as the first and the second largest economies on that. But I guess you're saying that
it's our common aim to establish indeed subsidies disciplines in the WTO as part of the WTO reform. And of course, there we need to work together with the US, with China, with others. The fact that the European Union has now achieved a real deal on foreign subsidies as regards investments is a good step towards future multilateral rules.
I'm interested in another subject you mentioned, the autonomous instruments that the EU is working on, especially the paper on foreign subsidies. Can you tell us a bit more on how advanced the Commission's work is on this? So just for the audience to understand, this would be an instrument where the EU could ban takeovers from companies, for example, Chinese companies, of EU companies, if these companies are subsidized above a level that EU companies cannot be subsidized, right?
Yeah, the EU has a long tradition in terms of its competition policy, which comprises both fusion control but also the subsidization of companies. These are so-called state aid controls, and it has been brought to the attention of the European Commission that we have a situation where we have companies from third countries which are state-owned and state-subsidized, the emphasis being on state-subsidized, and that these do not are not submitted to the same kind of controls as EU companies are, and the same kind of limits. So the idea here is to have, therefore, as long as we don't have multilateral rules, which is, of course, the best to have in the WTO, that the EU internal market would obtain a new instrument which creates a level playing field between foreign companies benefiting from state subsidization and EU companies benefiting from state subsidization, so that the similar level of disciplines would be applied. That's the thrust of it, and there is a proposal for such a regulation.
Can I come in here?
Yes, of course.
I would indeed hope, as Mr. Wiegand says, that the work on the instrument against illegal subsidies would make progress over this year. But there is a more general point here at stake, and that is whether this deal in any way, directly or indirectly, hampers our ability to defend our interests through unilateral measures. And I want to point out that there is a very sorry fact in this context, which is the fact that the work on the international procurement instrument, which is meant to level the playing field with regard to procurements, to create reciprocity with regard to procurement, has been stopped at the insistence of the German Chancellor's office in order to facilitate the conclusion of CAI. So in this instance, in a very practical way, Europe has failed to move forward unilaterally, as we should, because the Chinese have promised for 17 times, I think, since 2001, that they would move on procurement and never have. There is nothing in CAI on procurement, but then on the other hand, we don't move forward and member states block our unilateral action. That's not very positive.
Mm-hmm.
I'm being asked.
Yes, of course. I'm being asked to move to other subjects, but this, of course, is a allegation that I need you to confirm or deny, Gunnar. Is it true that there was a side deal on public procurement, basically, that the EU will not move forward with that instrument?
I can not confirm anything of that type, but I fully agree with Bütikofer that it is overdue that the Commission proposed international procurement instrument would indeed be adopted as soon as possible by the Council and then go into the Parliament, because the basic approach which we are pursuing in this readjustment of our relations with the Chinese side is, and this is not limited to China, it would apply to many more countries, that if your procurement market is open, ours also stays open. If yours is not open, then we cannot keep ours open. This is similar thinking as on the subsidy situation, and it is very important that either partners join the multilateral agreement, which does exist, the government procurement agreement under WTO, or enter into bilateral disciplines on procurement, opening up each other's market. Both is possible, but not to do either, neither the one nor the other. Then we have to have our autonomous instruments to ensure that reciprocity is applied. So full agreement with Mr. Bütikofer's political aim of getting this adopted this year.
So just
That's, by
to
the way,
summarize,
one of the key actions under the strategic outlook.
right. So to summarize, basically, you are in favor of this procurement instrument, but currently it's blocked in the Council by member states. And Rainer Bütikofer says that Germany in particular. Just to, we've talked a lot about trade, but I'm getting a lot of questions on other issues. Ian Bond, for example, is asking that there's a lot of concern in Australia and the US about Chinese propaganda activities, whether that's an area where the EU could or should coordinate with its partners. What do you think, Gunnar? Basically on Stratcom.
That we started to work a lot on strategic communication needs a few years ago due to a number of manipulative activities in this field by certain close neighbors of the European Union. This has been significantly enhanced, the work. It's the work against disinformation. And I think we are the only diplomatic service in the world which issues regularly so-called disinformation reviews, which was particularly relevant in the context of COVID recently. And yes, a number of countries have been mentioned in this context, including China. So influence operations in the wider sense, concrete cases of disinformation are being picked up. And this is certainly one of the areas which one has to include in the overall policy approach. Information is good, disinformation is not acceptable. Now we don't hear you.
Just summarizing, basically your answer is we're already doing this. We're already cooperating.
We already work strongly on this as EU. We are in contact with several international partners. Probably the Australians have been the most exposed of these partners. And certainly it would be one of the areas where we should indeed exchange best practice, learn from each other's experiences also with the United States.
Okay, so scope to cooperate more on strategic communications. To come back to other autonomous instruments, maybe not directly on trade, but more human rights. Rainer Bütikofer said that we should cooperate also with the US and UK on making sure that no forced labor products come into the EU. Gunnar, is that possible on an EU level? And do you think this would be done through the due diligence? So basically getting European companies to stop cooperating with companies that participate in forced labor?
Well, first I would like to highlight that it's the first bilateral agreement which China has entered into with this investment agreement, where there are specific provisions both on environment, climate change, but also on forced labor, meaning the implementation, the ratification implementation of the relevant ILO conventions. I know that some people say this is not good enough. How will it happen? There will be monitoring, but the key is one thing is what we would say in the multilateral ILO framework. Another thing is what we can achieve with additional steps in the bilateral framework, as now done in CAI. And the third is what can be done autonomously. And here, indeed, you are pointing at a due diligence framework, which the Commissioner for Justice is currently consulting on, and where I expect the Commission to make a proposal in the near future, so that companies would be under the obligation to provide evidence that they are not using products or inputs from forced labor. This is, of course, not limited to a specific third country. This would be applied globally, and this will be a significant self-certification requirement, which would also then include sanctions, meaning sanctions vis-à-vis our own companies operating in our own space of norms. This will be a proposal coming up soon to the Council and the Parliament.
Reinhard, is that what you were thinking of when you mentioned that the EU should follow the UK's lead here?
Well, I think we could go beyond that. We could start immediately by learning from the State Department and issuing a business advisory that informs our companies active in China how they could comply with existing non-binding rules. Secondly, we should look into the legislation that the US, that the House passed just before the end of the year, legislation that the Canadians are now developing, legislation that the Brits have announced. And of course, we can also use the tool of due diligence legislation, even though that might take some more time. And finally, we could even use CAI to push here, because frankly, who would keep Xi Jinping from ratifying ILO core conventions against forced labor if there really was the intention of doing so? So why should we contend with a language that is extremely vague and substantially just hot air? Maybe the European Parliament will decide to say, if the Chinese can ratify, then we can ratify too.
Okay. Some people are asking if there's anything that the EU can actually offer. Teresa Novotna is asking if there's anything the EU can actually offer as leverage to the US administration to cooperate. Gunnar, maybe you have an answer.
I can only recommend this very wide China policy community, which is participating as participants in this panel, to read carefully the proposal to which you have made reference, Jakob, before, which is the proposal for a whole set of new transatlantic agenda. And there are many areas which are proposed, including in areas where we could not even speak to the United States over the last few years, such as in the fields of climate change and environment, but also, very importantly, in the fields of new technologies, high technologies, and related standard setting. Just to mention two key areas. So the return of the US to multilateral frameworks and the cooperation in policy areas where cooperation was not possible over the last few years will certainly, I would not like to use the term leverage with the United States. The EU-US relation is sufficiently complex, and I think there is leverage of each over the other. But what is important is that we would work more together to have more capacity to influence as democracies and as market economies the international norm setting. And there, of course, is endowed more commonality with a democratic ally than with some other in the international norm setting process.
Okay. Lucrezia, to go back to your point on compartmentalization. So you say this is basically the EU's basic approach to China, that we treat economic aspects separate from other aspects, human rights or climate change. You made a point with Australia, and I thought it would have been actually interesting to discuss this with Gunnar now that he's with us. Can you just quickly explain this point? So, were you arguing that compartmentalization will be harder in the coming years, or are you saying that the EU needs to try to keep these topics separate if it wants to have any success with China?
So, I mean, I was referring back to the survey results, which indicate that expectation that things will remain as they are with that compartmentalized approach. What I think definitely it's going to be more difficult for the EU and national governments across Europe to do, because there will be more pressure, as China has become in 2020 a topic for mainstream debates as well, and a lot of parliamentary debates. There will be increased pressure on the EU side and our government side to explain and show transparently what the overall strategy is. So for sure, there's going to be more pressure. Whether this is a good approach or not, as I was saying earlier, I think it's going to be crucial to take some concrete steps on the rivalry dimension of our strategy on China, because that's what's going to be relevant. If we want to get more market access, fine, but we also need at the same time to make parallel actions to make sure that we defend our economic sovereignty and resilience. Looking at the case of Australia is indeed quite interesting. Also, obviously, I need to emphasize that is not an excuse to say we should not be tough on China, because otherwise look at what can happen. That's not at all the message. Quite the opposite. And I think that in general, there is a tendency to think through a false dichotomy of either we cooperate and maintain very friendly relations all the time, or we cannot have anything else. I think it's a false dichotomy, and we should move away from that thinking. Let me then quickly make a point about a key difference between Europe and Australia right now as things are. When it comes to China's coercive diplomacy, there has been at least a strong perception in Europe that we are dependent on China and therefore cannot be strategic or too much concerned about political issues as well. That is simply not true, because if we look at the simple data, for example, on trade, the average, I think, in 2019, looking at UN Comtrade data for EU member state exports to China was about 2.4% of their total exports. And I'm assuming that the picture is probably similar when it comes to investment. So I think, the EU and member states governments will be required to work both in terms of political narratives, because that's going to be very relevant as we navigate a shift in geopolitical environment, and also with some concrete actions. And I would like to link back to what you were just discussing with Gunnar Vigand. Some of those issues that our audience brought up are going to be very important. Chinese propaganda and disinformation is something that has become very relevant in 2020. Human rights issues, we have new tools to deal with that. Indo-Pacific strategies. So if 2020 was the year where we managed to gain some more consensus across Europe on understanding the China challenge, maybe 2021 is the year where we put more substantial issues on the agenda.
Great. That's I'm being asked to end this panel, but maybe that's a great end. Last question for every panelist. Do you agree with Lucrezia that this year will be the year where Europe takes more substantive action on China, Reinhard?
This year should be the year when we make the resolution that we will demonstrate to China that their aggressive opportunism comes with a cost. Their provocative incrementalism of hegemonic ambition has to be countered step by step. We haven't been doing that, and that's to our own disadvantage. And this is the year when we should begin doing that in coordination with partners.
Do you agree, Gunnar? Will this be the year for more autonomous action on the EU side?
I would like to first listen to the voice from Athens.
Okay. Do you want to?
Yes, thank you, Gunnar. I think that 2021 may very well be the end of naivete, which has become a catchphrase. In fact, 2020 was the end of naivete. And I believe that in 2021, this year, we will see a much more clear-eyed approach on the part of Europe towards China. At the same time, I think that some of the priorities or the order of priorities may slightly change. So far, there's been this talk of the economy first approach towards China. I think that the supremacy of this approach will be challenged. It may not be entirely lost, but it will be challenged. Because if there are various areas of cooperation between Europe and China, there's what I would call osmosis, if I can borrow this term from biology. all these areas of cooperation are interconnected. They affect each other. Political issues, of course, and geopolitical issues will affect the economic relations with China. And after all, this European Commission has called itself geopolitical, right? So one would expect some sort of reconfiguration in the order of priorities of the European Union towards China.
So Gunnar, was the Kai agreement the last economy first agreement of the EU with China? Or the end of the economy first approach?
Well, the Chinese side would certainly love to have an FTA with Europe, but there is no love lost on our side for such an idea. However, I would like to bring us into reality, and reality is COVID. And COVID means minus 7% growth for Europe for 2020, and we hope to get a recovery underway this year. Many parts of the world will be in a very deep depression. There's one country which will have positive growth in 2020 and a far more positive growth in 2021, and that is China. So I think to say the economy is of no concern to us and to engage in something like decoupling would be an economic mistake. That does not mean that we would not engage with many other partners to achieve that global economic recovery, but we certainly will need to work with China to achieve that socio-economic recovery. This will be the top priority for every single political leader in the world, whatever the political orientation is, beyond the health situation, which is, of course, the first priority. So let's get real in this. And then I would like to add the climate change challenge, which is the top priority for this Commission and for this Council. And we need the Chinese. 28% of world emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, comes from China. So the fact that Prime Minister Suga in Japan engages now on a climate neutrality target 2050, that the Koreans do it, and that even the Chinese have now said something about carbon neutrality by 2060 is a huge step. It needs to be properly implemented, and that's very difficult, because to become carbon neutral by 2060, China needs to stop using its carbon-based power generation. And that is as much as all of Europe has within a couple of years. So we need to certainly engage China on this overarching priority. That does not mean, and I want to be clear here vis-a-vis all those who are worried about security issues, about the human rights issues, about other political questions, that we would not be able to be very clear on these matters. This is the purpose of having a multifaceted approach. Europe has sent a clear signal when endorsing at the highest levels the strategic outlook in last October, that we are not going for decoupling and we are not going for isolation, but we are not going to close our eyes, nor do we shut our mouths, and we will listen. And we will be clear when there are rivalry issues, as Lucrezia called them, to be addressed. And I think we have proven this with the actions and the clear positioning on Hong Kong, on Xinjiang, on human rights defenders, on lawyers, on press freedom in China. And we will, of course, also be clear when it comes to Taiwan, as your expectations are that this could become a hotter item. So we must be able to do the one and the other, to cooperate and negotiate, but also to confront when necessary and to show clear red lines. And to do this together with partners who are democracies and market economies as us is a very important task which we need to reinforce. And let me finally say, reciprocity goes into for many fields. Innovation is one of them. Our research area is wide open for third country partners, including the Chinese. We must make sure that partners' research area is also open. We have to address information, disinformation. We have to address the situation of international organizations, that they are not abused and that they are not changed in the way they can operate. And we have to address security issues, notably on cyber and maritime security. This is all part of the wider approach which Mr. Bütikofer calls for, which Torben calls for, which Lucrezia calls for, but we cannot do only those issues. We have to also pursue our interests whenever this is possible to do in a self-confident and in a united fashion.
Okay, so more cooperation with the US, more autonomous action, but in the end, the economy will keep topping the EU's concerns. I think I have to finish this now. Unfortunately, thank you so much to the panelists for participating in this discussion, which was really timely but really interesting. Thank you, Reinhard, thank you, Gunnar, and thank you very much, Lucrezia, and hope to speak to you soon.
Thank you.
And thanks to all the listeners, of course.
I think I can take over from here, and I would also like to thank our panelists also from the first panel, our moderators, and indeed everyone in the audience for making the time today. This was just the start for what is going to be certainly an intense China and EU-China year. We have lots of things in store for you, including more events, but also great publications. And the first thing that I would like to invite you to is to have a look, or better to say, to listen into a podcast that we've just concluded and finalized with great panelists really on China and global issues, because that was the third part of what we wanted to cover today. You've realized it was already a dense session today. So thank you once more. Let me point you to that podcast if our colleagues could move forward with the slide here. But final thought is that we very much look forward to working with you, to our discussions with you. I think we've seen today how important it is that we have an open and transparent and very frank and often also very controversial discussion on all matters China. For that, MERICS wants to be a platform and will be a platform. We thank you for joining us today and look forward to being in touch in the future. Have a good afternoon and a good night and a good morning across the Atlantic.